Hey students, welcome to your syntax patterns 1 through 7. So in your editing document, you should have already edited for structure, which is those kind of big overarching edits, and hopefully you got some help from a peer or someone else. And now we're moving on to editing for syntax. And now syntax is just a fancy word for sentence structure. And so what I'd like for you to do is to do some intentional editing where you go through your essay and ask yourself where you can utilize syntax that will elevate your style. And one thing I want to point out about the directions is that syntax should be used intentionally to emphasize important sentences and showcase what makes them important. So you shouldn't just be using it somewhere randomly, just like where authors use literary tools, syntax, diction to emphasize important moments in their essay, so should you. And so you'll want to put some thought behind where you use your syntactic style. And again, in your essay, please make sure to bold, highlight, use the comment tool to indicate where you've used your sentence structures, because I will be looking for that. All right, so let me go to my presentation and we will go over the 7 syntax styles that you could potentially use in your essay. And for your next essay, there will be another group that you can use as well. So this is not the end of syntax. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So the very first pattern is just a simple use of the semicolon. Some of you guys might be like, simple use of a semicolon, but yes, let's go ahead and use the semicolon. So here we have pattern SV, semicolon, SV, and all this means is you have a subject and a verb, a semicolon, a subject and a verb. And so an example we have is he who knows, so we have our subject and verb, so requirements achieved. He who knows others is wise. And then we have our semicolon, and then we have our subject and verb. He who knows himself is enlightened. Another example we have is my favorite planet is, so we have our subject and then a to be verb. My favorite planet is Pluto, semicolon. It isn't even a real planet. So subject, verb. Okay, rule satisfied. Granted, with the to be verb, you always know that you need to have another word behind it, but yeah, we're good. So with a semicolon, you never have a conjunction joining the two clauses. So you would never write, my favorite planet is Pluto, semicolon, and it isn't even a real planet. That's a no-no. You will never have a semicolon and a conjunction. And remember, conjunctions are fanboys, for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. And so the reason why you wouldn't do that is essentially a semicolon equals a comma and a conjunction. So you could put my favorite planet is Pluto, comma, and it isn't even really a planet. Or you can put my favorite planet is Pluto, semicolon, it isn't even a real planet. So you can do one or the other, but you can't mix both. So I should never see you have a semicolon and an and, or a semicolon and an or. Actually, I should never say never. There's one instance later on in our syntactic lessons in which you would put an and with a semicolon, but it is a very special circumstance. So generally speaking, I should not see an and following your semicolon or any other fanboy. Now, when do you use a semicolon? You use a semicolon when the two sentences on both sides, the two complete sentences on both sides, have a common subject, and therefore you want the two sentences to be considered together. And so if we look here, my favorite planet is Pluto. It's not even a real planet. The subject for both of these is kind of the idea of Pluto and it being the same, like the favorite planet. And so it's referencing the same thing. It's a similar thought. It makes sense together. And that's why the writer uses a semicolon. We see that here again. He who knows others is wise. He who knows others is wise. He who knows himself is enlightened. So we have the same subject of he, and also we have the same kind of topic of being wise or enlightened. And therefore, it makes sense to put these sentences together. All right, so that's our first pattern. Let's take a look at our second pattern. So we have subject verb, semicolon, a transition word, a comma, and then a subject verb. This is probably one of my favorite sentence structures because it's so useful. You probably see me use this sentence structure in our directions all the time because I love it so much. Hold on, my dog wants something. I'll be right back. So let's see this sentence structure in action. All right, so she exercised every day. So we have our subject and verb, then we have our semicolon, then we have our transition word. However, comma, she, subject, still couldn't, verb, lift a car. That makes sense. So she exercised every day, however, she still couldn't lift a car. So with this semicolon, it's the same rules apply as previously. We have the same subject, she, we have the same topic of kind of exercise and strength. And so it makes sense that these two sentences would go together. They have a common kind of purpose. But because this sentence is in opposition of this sentence, we add in a transition word of however to help us better understand how we should perceive these two sentences in relation to one another. And so we add in the transition. We see it again here. I know the names of all the cheeses in the world, semicolon, therefore, comma, my mind is perfect. Now in this one, the therefore indicates that this second sentence is an outcome of the first sentence. And so that's what the transition indicates. My dog is beautiful and majestic, semicolon. Unfortunately, comma, her farts smell like the apocalypse. And so the unfortunately works like the however, where it indicates that the second part of the sentence is at odds with the first part of the sentence. And so I would strongly suggest adding this one in, not just to your essays because it's a requirement, but to your writing style because it's a highly useful form of syntax. All right, pattern 1B. So we have subject verb, semicolon, subject verb, comma, and subject verb, or subject verb, comma, but subject verb, semicolon, subject verb. That one's a little complicated. It'll make more sense in action. So the rain kept falling. Joan saw the roof begin to leak, and she put out a bucket to catch the water. So remember earlier I said a semicolon and a comma and an and are essentially the same thing. Now is where we're getting into the nitty-gritty details where I'm going to explain how they're not actually exactly the same thing. They're close. You can usually use them interchangeably, but there's actually a different purpose in it. So they communicate slightly different things about how the information is related. So when you have a comma and an and, the information is indicated as being more closely related than if you have a semicolon. So for instance, when we see Joan saw the roof begin to leak, she put out a bucket to catch the water. What it's doing here is it's showing a series of actions. So that's very closely related. Step 1, step 2, saw, leak, put out, bucket. And so the writer uses a comma and an and to join these two actions together, seeing them as being closely related. Then we have a semicolon that separates off this part of the sentence. The rain kept falling. Now here we do see a relation. It is the rain that is causing the leak. It is the rain that is filling up the water bucket. However, ultimately the subjects are different. The subject of the sentence is the rain. The subject of the sentence is Joan. It's just that we share the same topic of kind of flooding waters throughout this entire sentence, which is why they're using semicolons and commas and conjunctions rather than periods. They want all of this information to be considered together. But we can see how these two parts of the sentence are more closely related than this part. And so what the writer does is they indicate kind of these levels of connection through the comma and the and then the semicolon. So here we see the fish was a cannibal, semicolon, it ate a crumpled up goldfish cracker, comma, and it didn't feel any remorse. And so here we use the same thing where these two parts of the sentence are more closely related than this part of the sentence, and that is indicated through the use of punctuation. All right, pattern 1C, subject verb, semicolon, subject verb, semicolon, subject verb. Let's look at an example. Jaden got an A on the test. Jenny also got an A. Unfortunately, George got an ulcer. Poor George. So let's look at the other example before we talk about it. My dad is infuriating. When I ask for a loan, he doesn't even listen. Mom isn't any help either. So here we see this semicolon being used to compound information. In the first one, it utilizes parallel structure, which is a really good way to use this one. So it's the idea that Jaden got an A on the test. Jenny also got an A. So we see the parallel structures on these. And then the humor comes from the use of parallel structure where George, he got an ulcer. And so instead of an A, it changes to an ulcer and the humor comes out of that. And so the use of this semicolon helps build the humor where it indicates that each of these parts are very closely related. They're closely related, but then it has this kind of switcheroo at the end that creates the humor. Also notice how it's utilizing some of the earlier pattern where it brings in the transition, and you can absolutely do that. You can kind of play around with mixing these patterns as long as you're following punctuation rules. When this one, it's a little different. It doesn't use the parallel structure, so it's not as witty. But we have my dad is infuriating. Why is he infuriating? When I asked for a loan, he doesn't listen. And also on top of that, mom isn't any help either. So again, it has this kind of compounding information that the writer wants to be connected. So instead of using periods that would really separate these ideas, they use semicolons to show that they want it considered all together as being a problem. All right, pattern 2. On to a different pattern. So this one is subject verb, direct object, or subject clause. And you can also have a comma in there. So let's take a look at what this does to a sentence. So to really understand this, we have to look at an original sentence and then a revised sentence. So if our original sentence says, each student had an approach to the project, semicolon. Lily's approach was proactive. Nancy's approach was reactive. So this works, but it's quite wordy because of what I mentioned before. The parallel structure causes a lot of repetition. And so for sometimes that repetition's good. So for the previous example, the repetition of phrasing created humor. Here, the repetition is just unnecessary. So what you can do to revise this is you would keep each student had an approach to the project, semicolon, Lily's proactive, Nancy's reactive. And so what that does is it utilizes the first part of the sentence, the first clause, and it then allows for there to be a level of assumption where you don't need to repeat the words, you just put a comma instead. So what this does is because approach has already been kind of established as the direct object, it removes the direct object and just puts a comma instead. So each student had an approach to the project. Lily's approach was proactive. Nancy's approach was reactive. But instead of repeating and being redundant and saying approach was, the writer just puts a comma instead. And so this is a very efficient form of syntax that allows you to kind of pare down wordiness. Let's see it at use again. For many of us, the movie was a really exciting treat. For others, the movie was a demoralizing waste of time. So again, here we see the repetition of phrasing. And usually you can notice that there's a problem when it's like a to be verb, because to be verbs can feel very wordy, or any other kind of verb that's kind of small and unoriginal, to get, to be, to have. So for many of us, the movie was a really exciting treat. For others, a demoralizing waste of time. So this comma replaces the was-a and just implies it so that it doesn't feel as wordy. And so this is a really great use of a semicolon and then using a comma to indicate a replacement of wordiness. All right, we're towards the end of the video, so if you could head over to video 2 where we'll finish off looking at our other patterns. All right, bye.